Have to come to a leadership Strand for a technology conference and look at the room. So it's definitely worthwhile. We thank you for being here and signing up for this. You are in for a treat today, and we will get into that material in just a minute. I need to do just a few little announcements about the conference and housekeeping details and things like that. My name is Matthew Constant. I serve as the treasurer for KySTE, and I work in the Owensboro Independent School District. And let me just tell you a few things if you haven't heard yet. Wi-Fi should be better than last year if you were here last year. Progress always, right? So we're hoping that GH conference is wide open, accessible, and non-saturated. So that's what we're hoping for. There should not be a username and password. It should just be open access, we hope. If you need parking validation, please see the last two ladies at the registration area. They can validate your parking for you. And also you should, in your envelope today, you should have received a couple of tickets inside your envelope. One of those would be for the exhibit halls tonight. If you're coming to that grand opening tonight, you will need that ticket to drop in to be eligible for our awesome door prizes. So don't lose that ticket, drop it in tonight. Also, if you're going to our members-only reception tomorrow, there should be a ticket in your envelope as well, and you will need that to get admittance to that event. So, just a few things. Today, I want to introduce our first speaker, Michael J. You are in for a real treat today. I have only seen YouTubes. So now, I get the live in-person deal. So we sought Michael. We've been seeking him for a couple of years now. He's going to be a featured speaker in our main conference, but has agreed to do this leadership Strand part for us this morning. So I want to introduce Michael J. to you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here at this hour. It's not that early, really. So, can you hear me okay in the back? Yeah, I project pretty well, so I'm not going to wear the mic. Thanks a lot. I think, leadership, I particularly was interested in speaking with all of you, because leadership is absolutely fundamental, particularly around technology implementation. I do like, I wonder where everybody else is. They're probably in the other session about followership. But that's a different story, so we won't go there. Be talking about how we can use technology to support educators and students, as promised. So if we take a look at one learning environment, some of you may remember this when the world was black and white, and everybody was sitting neatly in the chair with their hands crossed in front of them. That's how you knew they were good students, right? So, and then here's a different sort of look at that classroom. Not that other classroom didn't get dirty occasionally, but probably not necessarily sort of this kind of arrangement where the students are working collaboratively around that. And then, of course, we look at kids now crowded around a piece of technology and working very differently. Notice purposely did not select kids sitting in lockstep in a lab, because hopefully that's not how we're deploying the technology now. We're looking at how to integrate that more and more into the classroom. But it's important to recognize that really it's about form follows function. And the function that we use is enabled by the form of the technology and how we're employing that. So the two are very, very closely related. We're going to explore that a little bit today. And the goal here is, we're not going to talk about specific products, right? Because we all get deluged by looking at different products. What we're hopefully going to do is take a look at about the changing nature of the products that you look at and that you use, and your expectations about the kinds of ways that you may use that. So that's sort of the part of the takeaway from today. So I'll start with a little bit from the arts, and we'll take a look at some early structures. These are medieval sort of churches. If you were to stand up next to this church, for example, and you were to go look at that wall, the wall at the base is probably wider than my arm span. If you've ever been to any of these, anybody been over in Europe and seen some of the churches there? I mean, some of these old churches are huge. And the reason is that the whole structure is supported on that base. The structure itself sits, and you can almost feel that with this structure, right? I mean, it sits so substantially right there. And here we see, again, sort of the upper limits of what you can actually do with this kind of piece here. The form of the structure itself also dictates sort of the nature of the structure and what actually happens within that structure. If we juxtapose that with the cathedral, it's a huge difference, fundamental difference in terms of the nature of the structure and the nature of sort of what it looks like inside the structure as well. And the big issue there, of course, and we all know this, is the flying buttress. And the key aspect of the flying buttress is about redirecting the force, the energy that's actually occurring within that. And that changes the very nature of the structure, it changes the way the structure can be used, and the whole essence of that structure. So, because we've thought about how to redirect that energy and rethink it, here we have a structure by I.M. Pei at the Louvre, and we rethink structure altogether. Here's a very old structure in the background, but a much newer structure up front, fundamentally different from the way we thought about structuring pieces before. The whole structure here is underground. The light is provided up here and actually illuminating the area down below. Here we have another structure, museum in Bilbao, I think, and again, very, very different structure. We wouldn't even think of historically as a structure, much, much more organic. And so if you look at sort of the educational cathedrals, I always feel like place metaphor here, it's certainly about the place where teaching takes place, but it's a lot about, it has a huge impact on the nature of how we learn and how we educate. It impacts really the resources we use, how we use them, and how we manage the relationships between those different resources. So thinking about those kinds of relationships and using that sort of building as a metaphor is useful. It's about directing the energy that we use to really create change. The tendency, right? I mean, I'm still a credentialed teacher and was a classroom teacher for a number of years. The tendency is we sort of end up focusing that energy on the things that we're used to doing in the past. And it's about really sort of breaking out of some of that and rethinking the very nature of how we do the work that we do. Looking at, structures and communities that recognize sort of the movement of energy, shifting from sort of separation of form and function to really looking at how they come together to create sort of efficient structures in our schools, and looking at how energy can be saved either by making possible previously impossible behaviors, things that we couldn't have done without the technology, or make us recognize new ways to use it. And new technology usually when it comes in gets used the way it was used in the past, right? But I think you as leaders, your role is to help people expand outside of that. And that means supporting the teachers that you work with and your colleagues and others to really break out of some of those boundaries and help them take risk and be supportive in that process. So another example of that, so that we're not just doing buildings, for those of you who are into aircraft, here you have an old Ford Tri-Motor, here's an old Sikorsky helicopter, Bolero, and sort of single-wing airplane. But all of these structures, what they have in common is that here, there's a huge internal structure to that aircraft. And it really limits how large it can be, how fast it can fly, and all the dynamics that are within that. A modern aircraft, so you're going to walk away not learning anything about the technology, we learn about architecture and aircraft. So, is that when you looked at DC-3, DC-2 coming in, what you notice is that in these aircraft, the skin itself, the very outside structure, is the structure of the aircraft. And if you take a look at the 787, if you look at the Dreamliner, forget the battery for a moment, if you look at the Dreamliner, if you look at that, the very structure of the aircraft, is that piece itself. And that fundamentally changes the nature of that aircraft, what it can do, where it can fly, the kinds of things it can do. And these look like minor steps if you compare it to actually hang on here. If you compare that to the previous aircraft, they don't look that different. They look very similar. And the same is true when we look at technology. So here's this other modern aircraft. It looks very similar to the aircraft that we looked at before. The tendency is to believe in our particularly when we're talking to parents and teachers and others, oh, that doesn't look like a big change. It's not a fundamental shift. This is a fundamental shift. And it leads to the ability to have these kinds of aircraft in place. It gives us the ability to be able to change the very nature of how we teach and learn. The tendency, of course, is to hang on to the old structure. And you forget that you can let go of that and really think differently outside the boundaries and make some of those kinds of really fundamental changes. So I do want to say that part of this is not just taking it all too literally in terms of, anybody know the story of the elephant here? Here's a large elephant, and he's chained up over here, right here. But you know something? In a moment, that elephant could break that chain. In a moment. They're really strong. What holds that elephant back is that when they're young, they're tied up to a post. And the young elephant pulls, and it can't get away. And it suddenly it recognizes that pull is something it can't break, regardless of the size. The same thing happens when we look at the technology that we implement and how we implement that. We get so used to the constraints of what we consider school and education and the demands of the community and who students are, et cetera, that we honor our old bonds, the old connections that we made in the past. And it's about questioning those and breaking those, changing fundamentally some of the suppositions that you make, some of the assumptions that you make about how we teach and learn. It's your role as leaders to really help create a safe environment where we can explore and break outside of those boundaries. Otherwise, you're never going to get the value out of the investment you make in the technology. And it's not about the technology, right? Technology is great. But I helped start something called the Classroom of Tomorrow project back in 1986, the Apple Classroom of Tomorrow. And there, every child had 2 computers, one at home and one at school, because computers weren't portable. And you know what we found is that they were doing the same kinds of things they were doing before. Well, in fact, the school that I worked with in particular was in Columbus, Ohio. And what we did is we actually paired up teachers. We gave them the afternoon to plan. We had students collaborating with each other. You know something? It was one of the most successful classrooms that we had. It had nothing to do with the technology. It had a lot to do with all the other things that you do with that. The technology was certainly an important enabler, but it wasn't the thing that created the change. So don't turn to the technology to create the change. See the technology as something that will help facilitate that. Don't honor the bounds, the things that bind you to the past. Really help move outside of those. And we'll talk about some of that. Data, as you probably already know, plays a critical role. There we go. And data is, however, may not be the first word in learning, but it certainly is not the last. And it's important that, historically we haven't had access to the data that we needed to be successful and to be able to document the kinds of things that we're doing. Now I think we do. I think that we'll explore that a little bit. Many of you are familiar with data warehouses, places where we can actually store that data and make use of that, and there's sort of shifts happening there. It used to only be about storing products, and we realized that it's really about managing information. And that information is a lot of information about how we teach and how we learn. If we take a look at these organizations that have been wildly successful, Amazon, eBay, Expedia, iTunes, YouTube, all of those organizations are really, we think about them as places where we buy stuff or places where we watch video or listen to music, but in fact they're all just big repositories of information. And we need to be, as leaders, demanding those same kinds of repositories for educational use. So it's really about bringing together those who need that information with where to find the kinds of answers that they're looking for. And again, that's for you as a leader, as a consumer, teacher as consumer, and student as consumer, in terms of trying to affect a change in sort of the nature of that environment. So where is the real value in those kinds of data warehouses? In a traditional warehouse, we think about improving product distribution, sort of reduce inventory errors because we have a centralized way to handle that. The ability to track and buy, buying trends, see where usage is, and then also adapt to new business models. And if we take a look at an educational data warehouse, looking at better management of the educational data overall and all in one place. Some of the best work that I've seen, for example, was kids who really were not being successful in school. And again, we had the data in one place, and they were trying to find why is this group of kids? They couldn't find anything in common between them. until they looked at the transportation system data, where they found out that all of those kids, or a majority of them, were spending over an hour on the bus each way to and from school. Well, in fact, when they exist in two different places, it's really hard to see the relationship. It's really hard for us to affect a change in the nature of how we teach and learn. So that school district said, okay, hang on, we could add more buses, but maybe what we need to do is make education take place on that bus as well. So they, in fact, thought differently about the nature of where education happens, how it happens, and in fact, those kids were given even additional assistance with their work, and really were able to bring up those test scores, were able to help those kids learn and engage better. So again, thinking outside of the box, because you have access to data from different places. The ability to reduce data errors, getting clean data, ability to generate reports in a consolidated report as I just described, but importantly is the ability to ask more complex questions. And that's part of, again, questioning the environment around you, trying to break outside of those bonds that hold you back, prevent you from making changes. Sort of Beatles reference there. He's a real data man, living in his data land, making all his data plans for hopefully somebody. We all know those people in the MIS department. They're often making data plans for themselves. Demand that those people listen to you, because that data, you are the consumer, and you need to be able to get access to that. Who is the data for? How will the use of that data evolve to be able to support that change in the very nature of the learning environment, and what kind of changes that can enable is absolutely critical. So this is a traditional warehouse. If we look at sort of, traditional, they're actually, you may have seen this before, they're automated now, a lot of them, where you can actually request information, device goes out, gets it for you, brings it back. I want one of those in my house, but you can't get them for your house, I've looked. To go get things. But this is a traditional warehouse. And what's important as we look at sort of the warehouse is the shift in terms of the nature of how information is shipped, how these things are shipped. So this is a traditional pallet. We all remember longshoremen. If you watch the old movies, they have those big crates coming down off the ships, and they're all wrapped differently, and everything's a different size. Big shift as we went from sort of the pallet out to the container. And that kind of way of structuring information, structuring the kinds of things that we do, created a fundamental shift in the nature of how we move things from point to point. And it's really all due to standards. I really recommend this book. It's a great book. It's not new. It's probably about a decade old now. Sort of the box, how the shipping container made the world smaller, the world economy bigger. It's fascinating. And you don't have to be a nerd to enjoy it, by the way. So this fundamentally changed the nature of how we ship things and how we move things. Think about the kind of shipping containers that we have in education, the way we can move things to make them easier to move around. Historically, we have things like the Schools Interoperability Framework, SIF standards. We have the IES, National Center for Educational Statistics, and we have now CEDS, the Common Education Data Standards, that are all emerging as common ways to move this data to help support you in being able to use that information to affect change. Yeah, you can't read this. I can't read this from up here. This is actually a reasonably small educational data model with different areas, whether it's around student attendance or curriculum or food services or all these different pieces. But it's complex. And yet you need to be able to touch all those different areas in that structure, that educational structure, in order to really affect the kind of change that you need to make long term. Here's a list. And I'm happy to share this with any of you. I actually got this from, his name escapes me right now, Jim Goodall, who heads up the Center for the Common Education Data Standards, looking at sort of all the data standards that are emerging now. Here we have this granular identifiers. All of you are familiar with Common Core, Kentucky being the first state to have adopted it, right? This is a more granular version. This is the Learning Resource Metadata Initiative. Here's the Learning Registry. Here we have, many of you, have you heard about In Bloom? Anybody read about In Bloom? So that's a recent Gates Foundation funded piece to help support teachers in really addressing personalized needs. Each one of these provides different data, but in fact there's some common elements across all of these that will allow you to get access to that information as you look at how to affect a change in how you work and how we understand what students do. So there's a common vocabulary across that, and it's through the Common Education Data Standards. So do, again, look for that as you're looking at kind of use of data. It's important to recognize that the data certainly is for you as a leader to be able to consume, but it also recognizes that learners of all types need to be empowered to use that information to inform their learning. And we all need to be learners, and that's at all different levels: classroom teachers, school level leaders, technologists, decision makers who are maybe a little bit more removed from students. And we need to make real-time information available. I think historically, as you're all aware, high stakes assessment has traditionally been a problem because you got the data when? A year after you had those students. Well, how does that help you to any extent? That's great. Now I know what I should have done. Well, that isn't very helpful. So again, getting access to it in real time, and the need to provide the ability to be creative and make informed, intelligent risks, take informed, intelligent risks around that is absolutely critical. So technology, however, of course, isn't a panacea when we look at the kind of use of this data. This cartoon, I know you can't read in the back, says, oh sure, 1.8, there's a big mainframe down here, and the student and the fellow, the salesman's pleading, easy mainframe home units. $1.8 million seems like a lot right now, but what about Randy? What about his future? Think what a computer like this will do for his SAT scores someday. So, you know, being held ransom, and this is not just for the parent at home, but also our schools, that the technology is somehow going to be the panacea. It's going to actually create that fundamental change. Well, in fact, that's not the case, as we've already talked about. The technology is not where the change happens. It's your leadership and how you look at affecting that change. It's really about providing educators, I think, with the tools that they actually need. Key to supporting educators as professionals. The technology should not take the place of the professional teacher, but really support them in the use. Good educators, of course, develop intuition. I can tell you about, and it's been a while since I've been in the classroom, but I can tell you about Doug in my 6th period, 9th grade science class, who's in the back. And I can tell you everything about Doug. I don't need my grade book in front of me. I don't need to know any of that. I can just tell you about him. Because I think teachers, we develop intuition about who students are and around their academic and social issues. What we need to do is figure out how to document that so that we can then make sense of it and then hope to change the very nature of how we're teaching. So the question is, how do we collect the relevant data to replicate what that intuition tells us about the seasoned educator? So I really, and the question is, can we collect that data? And how can we collect that data? So what is the right technology? And as I said before, it's really important to allow yourself to dream about this. Anybody dreaming yet? So here we go. New breakthrough technology, assessment for the masses. Absolutely essential that we look at some of the new technologies that we've been working on in educational systemics. This is fortunately my Nobel Prize presentation to share that technology with you. So we're going to go ahead and I'll share with you what we've been doing. So the problem that we tried to take on was how do we put real-time assessment in the hands of educators? Absolutely key. We need to do that. It's really crying for a pragmatic solution, not something that's just sort of run-of-the-mill. It's not just about gathering information to inform the curriculum. In fact, it's the ability to acquire population data that can be used to guide an individualized learning experience for every child. Of course, because you can, of course, link population to every child. That's how it works. The existing solutions include the hand raise. We're all familiar with the hand raise. Left versus right. I know that the experience that I had was the principal came into my classroom to observe me, and I used to tell the students, if you know the answer, when the principal is in here, raise your left hand. And if you don't know the answer, raise your right hand. I once called on the student who rose their right hand, and they said, "Mr. J, you're not supposed to call on me, so you have to keep it straight." The heads up and heads down approach to looking at that, and the one finger versus two finger, which can be misinterpreted, so be very careful with that. There's also the group mumble. We all know that one. You ask the class something and you get back this sort of mumble. Clarity is inversely correlated to the student's age, it turns out in that case. And also, this is my favorite, the cull from the herd. Look for the weakest student and then probe them until they cry. Absolutely essential when it comes to collecting that data. Existing solutions certainly include clickers. We're all familiar with these clickers. And this one's not working, so well, here we go. So all these different kinds of clickers are available. We then took on a 2-year research project, which was predicated on multiple intelligences, and certainly at least one. We're not sure which one, however, but at least one was used. We're looking for solutions with a multicultural perspective, because it helps you get grant funding, and a way to engage all learners without accountability for any one. Another piece that we really highly suggest for any kind of curriculum work you're doing. We're also looking to leverage existing student skills, and we really want to only leave a few children behind, not all of them. So, we tried a number of different means of communication, other than just the clicker. One is the American Sign Language. We tried Braille. We tried English. All of these were too slow and unintelligible, apparently, by our today's children. We had an aha moment, and that was really whistle languages. Well, don't laugh. This is real stuff here. Why is it whenever I say don't laugh? Okay. So, here we go. This is actually whistle language. This is a fellow from the Canary Islands, so named because they use whistle language there. So there's a long history of whistling. You may not know this. One is whistling is a lost art that could save our schools. In Turkey, Village of the Birds, in France, in the Pyrenees, in Mexico, long history of whistle. In Asia, long history, as well as New Guinea around that. In Silbo Gomera from the island, this fellow, Silbo Gomera from the island of La Gomera in the Canary Islands, used to communicate across rough terrain. And it's just important to recognize it's unrelated in any way to construction workers' whistles. Or so they say. So here's an example. Everybody listening along? Okay. His intonation is just wonderful, I know. We've all heard that one before. Lily says, you should go get the kids and have them bring the castanets for the party. How many times have I said that to my wife? And she responds, okay. So everybody try along. Go ahead, whistle an okay for me. I'm going to just single out the weakest in the set if you don't do it. Okay. A lame try, but you have to try it at home a little bit more. Important to recognize, of course, it's scientifically based, or else I wouldn't be getting this Nobel Prize. Linguistic perception, neural processing of language, areas of the brain normally associated with spoken language function are also activated in proficient whistlers. Language processing regions of the upper brain can adapt to a surprisingly wide range of signaling forms. So whistling is, in fact, a great alternative to simple, regular spoken speech. So we began the student whistle study we had some major findings. It showed that students couldn't pucker and blow simultaneously. Nobody's surprised, okay? Saliva and gum would sometimes escape at high velocity. We had some hair incidents. And then whistling was engaging for all learners. They all enjoyed the actual act of whistling. So we developed a low-tech alternative to this, because again, we found all these different problems, and it's for this that we're involved in. We call this blowhard assessment. So we have some little treats for you here. We'll actually give this a shot. So you'll notice when you get your whistle, it says blowhard assessment, music to every educator's ears. And then it says, because all learning is noteworthy. Keep that in mind. It's important to point out also that we have multiple functionality here. One is we have the standard A, B, and C response, but if you look closely at your whistle, depending on how old your eyes are, you'll notice that you've got the standard true and false, but you have this lost art of the merged T and F, which is the fudge factor when you're not sure if it's true or false. So this gives you the option to be able to do that. Does anybody have their whistles? Okay. Hang on, I've got a whistle too. Where's my whistle?
We've got one.
You have a whistle for me?
Of course.
Oh, here we go. I got it. Thank you.
Okay.
So, here they are. By the way, impressed. I've only heard a few people whistling so far. I don't know what that's about. You guys are such restraint. So let's go ahead and give it a try. Here's how you get the different tones for the whistle. So, if you look at this, this is my grandson here demonstrating this. So if you want just an A, you're going to cover the B and the C. So go ahead and do that and blow. I think you've all done this before. Okay, C now. Okay, and the last one is B. Okay. Here we go. Let's try a few questions, and what we're going to use is the oscillation quantifier that we've developed to go with this. Okay, so the first question we're going to ask is technology useful in helping students learn? True or false? Hang on. Take a breath. There we go. Okay, so you see the peak. Okay. There's always one. Let's see here. Technology keeps getting slower and slower every year. So we see a clear peak here. You don't have to buy any of those clickers. What the heck? Okay? So I'm going to ask you one more question. Okay? Here we go. 2 trains leave a station from opposite directions. Go ahead and just blow. So there you go. There's a lot of ways you can do this, but So we got some feedback from students as part of that process. One is, it's so much fun, I forgot it was a test. Another piece of feedback was, finally I get why we take notes in class. That 50-item test took my breath away. When was the last time you heard that? My perfect pitch increased my grade in algebra. And they put the ass back in assessment. So what are the implications of this? The implications are, with minor investment, every student can blow their assessment. Right? You don't hear that often. Easy for administrators to make sure assessment is actually being conducted. They can do that by just walking down the hallway very easily and listening in. It brings the performing arts back into our schools and harmony into our classrooms. And it's inherently aggregated assessment, right? We all heard it. It's pretty easy. And lastly, it automatically has weighted results. You just don't hear the kids in the back of the room quite as much as you do the ones up front. So, and we know the good ones always sit up front, right? But now there you go. So our next projects that we've got working are a panpipe project, PPP, to increase data granularity with a grant from the Zamfir Institute, for those of you who remember Zamfir. We have a slide whistles for more qualitative analysis. And we have an integrated assessment for animals that echolocate. So we're working with dolphins and getting some feedback from them in that process. So thank you for listening to this presentation. Okay, well, come back from my dream state. Thank you. So not all data is created equal. The data can be different depending on sort of how you're collecting it. How you capture that data more than quantifies, it actually qualifies. Not qualifies the student, but qualifies to give you a broader picture of who that student is. It benefits from access to that kind of rich data. We hear a lot about big data today. Big data is absolutely important, but I really like what Larry Berger said about data. If you've ever heard a good definition of big data, this is the one I love the most. Data that lets you ask new, powerful questions even after you've collected that data. To me, that really is the essential piece of this, which is, if you have to ask the question and then collect the data, you're not probably collecting the big data. It's about having that enough density and enough information there to be able to do that. Lenses for learners is a concept that we need to create systems where the subject plays an active role. We can't expect that the technology assessments are going to give us everything that we need to be able to understand the nature of the environment. We want the learner to play an active role in that process. Right now, when we look at the data that we're collecting very, very simple kinds of data. These are very simple lenses if you think about it. We're collecting data that has also results in simple models. It's no wonder that the data we have is not predictive and that you as leaders have limited information to be able to provide direction. What we're really looking at is creating these kind of compound lenses, increasingly complex, and where real models will be more complex and have more predictive capability to them, so that you can then make better decisions around that data. It's about where educators don't have to read raw data. Many of you are familiar with the movie The Matrix. Seen it? So, there's sort of this epiphany as sort of the images emerge out of the data. It's not going to happen, right? I mean, nobody's going to look at tables of information and suddenly see which students are doing better or which ones are not doing better. Millions of years of evolution have not prepared us to read streams of data. In fact, this next slide, does anybody see a problem with any of these images here? Oh, come on. Does anybody see a problem? Okay, how many of you are physicians? Anybody a physician? Okay, how did you know there was a problem if you're not a physician? It doesn't look right. That's right. It just doesn't look right. It's an x-ray. This is actually somebody who was playing basketball. Ouch. And something has clearly gone awry. I can't tell you how you would fix it. I can't tell you whether there's if anything's been broken, or if there's soft, if there's injury to a tendon, or what's happening. But I know there's something wrong, and we need to then look at how we can create tools that allow us to be able to look at this level, that help us identify problems much more easily with students. You need to look for products that are doing that. You need to ask for products that are helping you and the educators with whom you're working to be able to get that information and be able to make it useful right away. Just telling somebody the data is there is not enough. How do I actually act on that? So ease of use is absolutely critical. The ability to see trends and develop queries around the data, ways to capture information and generate a community of informed practice. And that means that everybody's working together to make sense out of that information. And also tools that allow educators and learners to focus on the education and not the technology itself is absolutely essential. It's really about supporting the educator here. Here's Neo in the matrix. And educators need to be given the tools that allow them to look at the challenges and as they continue teaching. So Neo's been fired at by several people, and he's picking up a bullet. And there are several of those. Here's the educator, there's legislation, there's assessment, there's curriculum, there are lots of things, Common Core assessments, there are lots of things that get fired at us as teachers. And we need to give educators tools that allow them to be able to slow it down, to be able to make sense out of it, and be able to change the very nature of how they're working. So it's about transcending the technology, it's about taking advantage of the savings that the technology can afford us. Remember back to the buildings that we talked about at the beginning of the talk. It's about letting the technology lift us out of that sort of heaviness around the kind of way we think about how we work, and changing fundamentally the kinds of things we can do. It's about transcending the limits of the technology by taking informed ownership of the learning. It's about collecting information and giving the learner more ownership over that as they continue to progress through their learning. And this then lays the foundation to drive rather than just respond to continuous change. I think that's the biggest issue, is we spend so much time trying to respond to it that we don't get ahead of it. You have to be a risk taker. When you're here at the conference today and tomorrow, look for ways you can change the kind of ways that people work, who you work with, the kind of leadership that you can provide to your colleagues and to others to get out from under the ways that we traditionally do our work. Don't just try to make these smaller changes. Look at how to make some of the big fundamental changes and look at ways you can bring people along. It means taking risk, but it also means incredible job satisfaction and also fundamentally changing the nature of how students learn and really getting to kids. It's about making the matrix really do our bidding in this process, and I think that's absolutely key. We need to take ownership of it and not let it be done to us. So with that said, that's my talk this morning. Thanks. I don't know what time it is.
It's 11:45.
Good. Questions?
Yes. Is your information that you just presented, is it available on KySTE's website or any other place where we can access it later?
I don't think so, but I can make it available, so I will do that. And you can tell me how to do that, or I can talk to...
Yeah, we'll get it on there.
Okay.
Great, happy to do it. Questions about the talk?
I love the elephant analogy. That really hit home.
Did it? Yeah, because it really is the case. You know, a big elephant has no problems tearing anything out of the ground. But, you know, they don't move. So do think about those elephants and those posts, because they exist. And it's particularly, thanks for bringing that up, I think it's particularly problematic because if we look at one of my graduate professors did research about who selects to become a teacher. And it's those who have been successful in schools before, right? You don't go become a teacher if you weren't good at school. But it was typically the way we think about school historically. And so we bring all of that baggage with us. And so we do it the way that we're comfortable with it. We have to disrupt it. We have to, you know, it's already broken for some people already. So don't be afraid about breaking it some more and trying to reassemble it in new and different ways. You know, physicians kind of have it right, because you know what physicians call the place that they work? They call it a practice. Maybe there's something to be said about the concept of an educational practice. You know, I won't say that practice makes perfect, but it certainly makes you better. Yeah, really question those. I'm glad that resonated for you. Questions, comments?
Can the whistles be obtained for a whole classroom set or maybe 8th grade set?
Of whistles? I can show you where you can get them. We don't have a lot of them, but they're not that expensive. You can get whistles. Have kids bring their own whistles. That's the way to do it.
Yes. It is a response to intervention.
It is a good RTI strategy.
Engaged.
Yeah, they would be engaged, and also, you know, it's less. By the way, part of the message behind that is it's less about the data you're collecting than the process itself. Quite honestly, it's about. I love it when kids in those kinds of assessments cheat off one another. I love it. You know what we call that? Working together. So there's something to be said for that. And you all know this, right? Teaching strategies, there's nothing better than being subversive. If they think they're getting away with something, they'll do it over and over and over again. So feed that beast. They love that. My students, whenever I would start out my science classroom, especially my freshmen, we'd start out with sort of a sponge activity question that they would have to answer, and they'd like to see if they could get Mr. J to discuss it, not just that day, but a second day or even a third day. They thought they were getting away with it. Well, in fact, we were addressing all the topics that we had to in that class, all along the way. But again, they owned it, they drove it. So give them an opportunity to do that. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? I'll be around for the conference, and so I'll be here tomorrow morning speaking different talks and related topics, although, so I hope you'll be there. Thank you.
For those